So to figure out what kind of tool that will benefit you to build an application, you kind of have to ask yourself the question, what kind of application are you building in the first place? And I like to think about a spectrum of applications between an e-commerce type of experience and a productivity type of experience. Like there's many ways to look at this, but this is one way to look at it. So this is a wide spectrum, so I'm kind of looking at the edge cases here, but it gives us something to talk about. Because if you think about like an e-commerce type of experience, it's very much route driven. Like the user is navigating routes all the time, and it's important that that feels like a seamless experience. But if you go to the far end of the productivity spectrum, you don't really navigate around different routes that way. You kind of stay in the same experience, and you would do more like URL manipulation. You would put state from a UI, which is typically way more complex, and use the URL as like a state store. So when you refresh, you will see the same layout and you will have the same tools open. Now, if we go back to the e-commerce side, it's really important that it's server-side rendered, because this has to do with search engine optimizations, and you really want to make the user see something immediately. Now, on the other side of the spectrum with productivity types of applications, you don't care that much about that, because normally you have to sign in anyways. There's not that often the content is public. And also with the complexity of the application itself, you typically do like a client-side bundle. And you do a lot of lazy loading, not lazy loading per page, but lazy loading per feature. On the e-commerce side, you need to capture as many users as possible. So doing a progressively enhanced application makes a lot of sense. But on the productivity side, you can really target modern browsers. You completely rely on JavaScript to create the experience. Looking back at e-commerce, those users typically use the application for like a few minutes. And in the productivity world, you might be using it for several hours and even have sessions that's crossing multiple days. In terms of data fetching, you really want to minimize the data fetching in an e-commerce solution, because you might be on a mobile device, which means that you're on a mobile network. And the way you really want to do this is to have like just-in-time data fetching. So you want it to feel as seamless as possible, but you also want to minimize the data fetching. But in a productivity type of application, you typically sit on more of a laptop, desktop type of experience. You're on a Wi-Fi or like a local network, and you can do a lot of upfront data fetching. You don't need to get into the experience immediately. You can get a lot of data so that the rest of the experience feels super, super snappy. Even though there's certain data you don't use, that's perfectly fine. On the e-commerce side, one thing that you often hear about is the Lighthouse score. And this ties very much into, like for a very typical e-commerce type of experience, it's tied to money, basically. How much do the users buy from the e-commerce side related to the Lighthouse score? So this is really important. That's like how you measure how successfully implemented an e-commerce application is. When it comes to a productivity type of application, it's more about the performance of the reconciliation when you're dealing with React. Like, how snappy does everything feel? Does it feel like a native type of experience? In general, when it comes to state management, in an e-commerce type of application, you don't really have like client-side managed state. Maybe you have a little bit, but even like a shopping cart, you want that to be server-side so that you can like send emails and notifications to the users, even though they're not using the using the application itself. So the management of state is very much related to data, like getting the data from a server into the application and what's the state of that data. On the productivity type of application, you have vast amounts of client-side specific state. You also have data there, but that's not the biggest challenge to manage. And one overall perspective on this is that when you choose a tool to build either an e-commerce type of application or a productivity type of application, you can find a tool with a much higher abstraction on an e-commerce type of experience, because those experiences are more similar than different, arguably. So you might end up with a solution like Next.js or Remix or something similar. But when it comes to a productivity type of application, they are more different than similar. They have more fundamental requirements or things that needs to be dealt with. But it's really difficult to create a high abstraction that fits all of those applications. So you need a more lower level tool to handle that. And that is what Impact is. It's a tool for the productivity end of the spectrum. So it's a lower level tool. So you get the freedom and the flexibility to make that productivity type of experience as good as possible for your users.